So welcome to everyone in the room and online. Thank you for joining us for today's seminar. It's a cross-disciplinary seminar. We're usually the history and archaeology seminar, but now we're the history, archaeology, economics, development studies seminar for today, with Professor Howard Stein from the University of Michigan and from DAS, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies. And also, I didn't know epidemiology. I wasn't aware of that. Who will be presenting today on institutionalizing neoclassical economics in Africa, instruments, ideology, and implications. Which is I'm looking for is a published paper in the journal Economy and Society from 2021, and will be the subject of the discussion today. We're also joined by Dr. Susan Kavuma from COBAM's Department of Policy and Development Economics, who will be the discussant. So we're very, very pleased and honored to have you with us for this seminar. Just for those online, the format is we'll have a presentation about 45 minutes or so by Professor Stein. Then we'll have comments up anywhere 5 to 10 minutes from the discussant, and after Professor Stein responds, then there will be a discussion from the audience. If for those online, if you could just keep your audio off until we get to the discussion session, and then you can use the raise hand button or just type a question into the chat when the time comes. So with that, I'd just like to hand it directly over to Professor Stein for the presentation. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks very much. I think what I'll do is when I ask you to change, I'll just like move my finger.
All right,
so we don't have to see change every time.
All right, I'll keep my eyes open.
Sorry, I've got a real problem getting on the internet. Some firewalls the university has put up, so I can't get access to anything. Can you hear it? Okay. That was a little closer. Thanks very much. And thank you very much to my colleague here from Development Economics and joining us so we can have a nice discussion, I hope, afterwards. This is a very strong element of history in this as well. History now has become part of my lifetime. I don't know how that happened. And so many of the personalities and these developments I've witnessed personally. I know these people that have been involved. And over a period of time, I visited the ARC on many occasions, for example. My colleague was the late Professor Beno Ndulu for 2 years. We taught together at University of Dar es Salaam. So I've had the opportunity to observe this, what's gone on, and with it, of course, the problematic nature of the transformation of economics on the continent, and actually involved now with trying to set up a new economics network, which will broaden thinking to draw on a whole series of other theoretical approaches, working closely with a number of people with Kodasria in Senegal. I'll be talking about the paper, but also talking beyond the paper, because the paper is 2021, meaning that I keep writing, I keep thinking, I keep working on the subject to try to allow it to go forward. Okay. So the lecture really will explore, and I've written it out in very great detail because I talk quickly and it's easier to follow. English often is not the first language when I give talks. So it's a quite detailed PowerPoint. It'll be easy for you to follow. And really what I'm focusing on here is the changing nature of the economics profession in Africa and its policy consequences. And I'll be looking at a series of factors that have generated the policy outcomes in a post-war Africa, with a heavy focus on the type of economic theory that has generated it. Economic theory itself cannot explain policy. One has to understand the role of power and ideology. So here I have to draw on other disciplines, or more broadly, institutional economics, rather than the kind of narrow neoclassical approach, to try to understand the confluence of factors that have come together to change the nature of the trajectory of African policy, and I would argue with great consequences to what has happened on the continent. So what do I mean by theory, power, and ideology? It's always good to put your chips on the table so you can see them. And by theory, I'm looking at a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on principles independent, what we're attempting to explain. Power, obviously, is then the ability to affect outcomes and does not simply rely on coercion for that purpose. Power is exercised both with rewards and punishment, and it's really most effective in the context, of course, known by Gramsci historically, of the legitimacy of the power. The subjects of the power have to have a common set of shared beliefs and understandings, and hence institutions and institutional constructs like organizations are absolutely effective for the operation of power. One has to operate with the same process of constructs and thinking. It's the very heart of institutional economics. Institutions, in my view, it's not the new institutional economics. I work in the original institutional economics and the tradition of Commons and Veblen, and their habits of thought, common to the generality of men and women, and very embedded historically in social psychology. You know, by nature is when economics got away from this borrowed metaphors from pre-Newton, by basically Newtonian physics and kind of pre-quantum physics, where everything was in equilibrium. And so economics kind of adapted this from the 70s and 80s. There's some very good books that have been done on this, understanding where this came from. And in some sense, it still very much drives the thinking in economics is focus on equilibrium, from the metaphor of physics. And what I'll argue is that the donors use their power, and it's well documented, I've continued to document this, to train economists in sub-Saharan Africa and neoclassical economics, relying very heavily on punishments and rewards, and was enormously important in implementing their policy agenda. By ideology, what I mean is a systematic body of concepts or a set of integrated assertions, theories, or aims that constitute a social and/or political program. The dominance today of neoclassical economics on the continent is a major constraint, in my view, in generating alternative frameworks dealing with what is the fundamental structural transformation in African economies and a myriad of challenges. And I'll get into a bit of this at the end of the talk. The ideological preference of African regimes is also extremely important. Ideology often is embedded in your choice of theories to understand the world around you, to help construct and support particular policy programs, particular policy agendas. It helps in some senses to also concatenate the economics profession with its heavy commitment to the principles of neoclassical economics. Arguably, I would say today the economics paradigm is it's not a normal paradigm in Kuhnian sense. It's an ideological paradigm. What really connects economists and neoclassical economics is really a shared set of beliefs that are constructed. Go ahead. Let me begin by reviewing a bit of the history of development economic thinking in the post-war period before actually turning on the interconnection between ideology, power, and neoclassical economics that came to then put in place what very much dominates today, this kind of a neoliberal mindset, which is very ubiquitous in Africa and and for that matter worldwide. Go ahead. So the late and very brilliant Tandika Mkandawire was a friend, and in my view, every economics undergraduate should and graduate student should read his work. And he wrote in 2014 that the history of economic doctrine in Africa can be divided basically into three stages. One is the planning era, which was primarily focusing on structuralist premises on development. The second was the structural adjustment area, heavily dominated by neoclassical understanding of the economic crisis. And the third is the post-Washington consensus area, which is more of an eclectic foray in areas of social science, but really relying very systematically on the neoclassical economic framework. So basically, research once was carried out in universities and regional or international organizations like the UNECA, IDEP in Senegal, using developing economic models which are much broader than we see today, such as capital-centered models, all of the basic rights and human rights models associated with even more radical notions of dependency. Some focus basically on how national economy was internally articulated, or how they were integrated, how the integrated role of fiscal policy. Others were critical of the adequacy of the national bourgeoisie, but very much looking at understanding how economic systems operate in the real world. What are the class formations? Who are the actors? Basically, rather than what became, of course, this methodological individualism that's come to dominate, that somehow you're not a social being, what you are is an individual maximizing being, which is at the heart of neoclassical economics. The nation state then there was criticism of how the nation state was actually then incorporated into the global system. Individual economists did a lot of work in my days in University of Dar es Salaam in the 80s. We did research on the country. It wasn't generated by donors. We had a wonderful speaker series based on empirical research that we did using alternative theoretical approaches. They weren't doing what effectively has become whatever the donors are paying historically. It was a huge transformation of the nature of what the economics profession got into, which was, donor generated, and why that is, we'll get into in a moment. African economists were very interested in industrialization, technological acquisition, the use of gains from favorable trade conditions for industrialization, and reading, some of the great development economists like Albert Hirschman, or even John Maynard Keynes, for that matter. The economists, barely, I doubt you'd find very many economists that have read the general theory. I have. And they argue the very essence of development economics in post-war and post-depression period was a challenge to what was the model economics, because historically, this kind of laissez-faire economic view did dominate the economics profession, but there was a big transformation following the Great Depression, and the work of Keynes to challenge this singular approach. And a lot of it has to do with somehow these powerful theorems of universal validity, and a notion that the market economy benefits flow to all participants, whether individual or countries, from all voluntary acts of economic intercourse. There was a widespread recognition that state intervention planning was needed. It was a very core of development strategies for developments in African countries. The emphasis then was on economic policy, but also planning techniques like input-output, cost-benefit analysis later, project planning, et cetera. Often the big challenge in these cases was a lack of data, but they did very much emphasize the necessity of understanding the market economy is not going to operate by itself. One needs all sorts of form of formulating, finds what ways to kind of an ordered fashion do state intervention. Donor-driven training of economists was largely confined to civil servants in the planning or project management institutions. Donors supported some teaching in economics in African economies, but it was rarely any assistance on a singular model, which became dominant now in the economics profession, the structured adjustment area. And so what we have then is economics and universities were not narrowly policy oriented, but they were not being done at the behest or the behalf of the policymakers' donors. That changed. Most of the economists did not work within a directly normative policy framework, and definitely did not work in the consultancy mode until later, when there was a massive crisis in the field. Researchers were interested in the relevance of their work and independent research within the university, and shared a kind of overall view of policymaking about the necessity of development and planning. There were dissident voices from the dependency school, by people like Samir Amin, but even then, among them, there was some notion that the state still could play an effective role, even with the problematic nature of the global system, which in some ways impeded the development process. There really was, not to say there was not sort of efforts by the major powers to push their own economic doctrines, but part of that was a much more broader fashion, because a lot of it had to do with kind of the move against communism. It was a kind of the period in which you had the Cold War and dual systems, and so there was a notion, well, we need to kind of take a different approach, but not so narrow as it became with neoclassical economics. There was a belief that disseminating somehow a worldview was in the national interest. Leading economists in the US moved easily between academia, the State Department foundations, and even the CIA. So in general, there was an agreement that this could be best achieved by bringing African students to the US, so there was that tradition, and sending US faculty to African universities. There was really no need for the kind of heavy-handed indoctrination or steering of emergent academic communities, which came later. Liberal, pro-liberal, anti-communist worldview was sufficient and simply enhanced by supporting new African universities and research centers without directly telling them what they had to focus on. A lot of funding of economics together with social sciences existed through foundation support to university staff and development economics. But generally, foundations were content on providing fellowships for Africans to study at good universities, without having to insist on the economic studies should be of a particular type. And even then, of course, at that time in the 60s and 70s, there was much more diversity in the economics in American universities. Not today, in which there's enormous dominance of neoclassical economics. There was enormous pressure. There wasn't kind of the enormous pressure of monolithic discourse that would be pronounced in the 80s and 90s. The predominance of national funding universities and multiplicity of benefactors permitted some degree of openness of funding of non-stream ideas and provided the chance for a broad spectrum of ideas. And so there was every theoretical approach when I taught in the 80s in Dar es Salaam of debating and taking analysis with a mutual respect. There's different ways of looking at the world. The relative financial independence of national universities from foreign funders, the more pluralistic intellectual environment in a much less unipolar world, which happened, of course, once the Soviet Union dissolved, and the self-assertiveness of new states permitted a much more intellectual terrain, at least with the university premises when compared to what happened later. This changed. The alternative perspective of the 60s and 70s gave way in the 80s and 90s to return to monoeconomics with a focus on neoliberalism and a standardized doctrinal textbooks representing ideals, neoclassical versions of Western economics. Today, I would argue that many of the economics departments, and I've lectured and traveled in many of them in Africa over the years, simply look like American university dominated neoclassical departments in the developed world, and they're taught the same thing as they're getting in these African countries. The question comes, how and why did it come about? And of course, what is the consequences of this? So institutional economists, which I am, and sociologists have long recognized the powerful socializing impact of formal academic training. Socialization by nature involves the internalization of common constructs of understanding that helps concatenate the actions of individuals to alter the world in a coordinated fashion. In an academic setting, of course, it's buttressed through the utilization of rewards and punishment. It begins in that world of allocating grades, followed by the battle for recognition through the mechanism of peer review and a hierarchy of journals, often reflecting the priorities set by those with disciplinary power and resources. The institutionalization of approach to a discipline is more effective when it involves extensive training, is authoritarian in nature, and where textbooks then provide a common curriculum, and they're presented as somehow the highest conceptualization of the field of knowledge that allows for the discipline to progress. Neoclassical economics basically has succeeded largely through its ability to follow this approach. From the beginning, students are presented with models of pure competition, optimality, and difference curves reflecting utility maximization, equilibrium, marginal analysis, as if they are somehow immutable laws underlying economic behavior. And today, this is the same introductory microeconomics class in virtually every single economics mainstream department in the world. And it's seen as a commitment to the spirit of the market. The self-interest and profit maximization is by nature seen as good for society. Classrooms frequently lack a culture conducive to open debate. I am not permitted to teach in the economics department at the University of Michigan. I have little to do with them, but I do get economics students come over to take my classes. And frankly, I often ask them when I represent this, is this what you're getting? And they say, yes. I have yet to say, no, you're wrong, professor. And so it's the same thing reproducing, not even when you have a crisis and not even discussing it, at the time when You had the Great Recession, not a single conversation going on in these economics classes as to what the cause was. Emphasis typically on technical and the formal, and learning the language that allows students to think like economists, with an almost exclusive reliance on textbooks purportedly representing the latest expertise in the field, but typically representing simply variations on the same model in micro and macroeconomics. A similar hierarchy is built into the economics profession itself. Promotion and recognition is measured by your publications in neoclassical journals, which are then controlled by the neoclassical journals that accept the papers. And they largely use the same constructs of understanding, the same mathematical models, the same kind of theoretical constructs. There's really little incentive for the profession to change. In fact, myself, having taken a different discourse, has not been easy. It's been a lot easier for me to be a neoclassical economist, a pretty good mathematician. I can do econometrics, but I couldn't wake up in the morning and look at myself in the mirror because I knew it was so problematic, in terms of our understanding of the world. But it is a great risk and punishment to you when you begin to stand up against the economics profession. And I can give you many stories of this, even here in Africa and elsewhere, of how incredibly intolerant there is of alternative views inside economics firms. I hope I hear a different story here at Makerere. Collender, for example, observes about the lack of an input from the Great Recession of 2008 and provides a good explanation of how neoclassical economics is able to perpetuate itself in the face of overt disconnect between their paradigm and the real world. Economics profession is a complex system. You have hundreds of thousands of economists trying to survive and prosper within the rules of the constructs of the institutional configuration of their profession. Stability in the profession is not for encouraging, pluralizing, theorizing, but in operating with a set agreed set of tools, norms, and doctrines. Academic economists dominate the field and generate a hierarchy of publications that determine rewards and standing. And revenues then flow to individual economists are not sustained by giving the best policy advice or by the most accurate predictions, but in fact, how they're recognized inside the profession. And there's a little game going on. I hear the chair of my department constantly complaining, if only we didn't have to pay these economists what they're demanding, it would free up money for the rest of the faculty. And then I look at my salary and I say, there's no problem here. I don't think I'm one of the ones grabbing into the resources because in essence, I'm not being paid like economists because I'm not in the economics department. So basically, it pertains to economists and academic job, but it's also found, it's very widespread. And in fact, this whole perspective has dominated so many years that even you see it inside the acts of journalism and the kind of more policy-based. People take these constructs with them, and that's how they understand the world around them. Economics profession is a closed system, which the relation of its resource to the outside world is of secondary importance. What is most important is economists in this closed system react to their work. And in essence, what you have effectively is an ideological paradigm. It's not a normal Kuhnian paradigm. Science progresses through a stable discipline matrix of a paradigm that could advance the understanding of the phenomenon being examined. It constitutes the creation of communities with shared theoretical beliefs, values, instruments, and techniques, and even metaphysics. And it's quite clear neoclassical economics have that dimension of the paradigm. But it fails miserably in advancing our understanding of its subject, the economy. Because in fact, economists really don't study the real world. And we've gone this over and over again. Soderbaum identifies this as an ideological paradigm, not a scientific paradigm. As Kuhn argues, the need for a replacement of paradigm is driven by the fairly resistant paradigm to solve key anomalies. By this measure, I would argue neoclassical economic paradigm should have been replaced a long time ago in Africa and elsewhere. But it isn't simply the profession itself with its internal dynamics of power. It's quite evident, we can have a long discussion of it, that it ends up, neoclassical economics ends up serving the vested interests. That's why it's perpetuated. It provides a worldview that in some senses explains and maintains a status quo of extreme inequality of wealth and income that we see in the world. In some senses, it's very important to never separate the instrumentality of the economics for its very essence. It's there for a reason. It's not simply because it's internal. If it was so, it was of no service to certain elements in the world, it would have disappeared, but it continues. As donors shifted, and I think we can use a very good example of what happened here in Africa, as donors shifted from supporting state-sponsored planning and import substitution towards structural adjustment in the 80s, they met resistance. I'm creating instability in the internet, it looks like. They met resistance from local economics departments, other academics. I witnessed all of this, who have been trained in other theoretical paradigms, had little connection to the neoclassical model that provided the theoretical core of neoliberal policies. As Makerere points out, the World Bank in its initial approach bypassed local economists by directly dealing with politicians. And it created what we call later ownership problem, because it was a bit on the extraneous side and imposed, and here it was a question of the illegitimacy, creating, as they say, a principal agent problem. The World Bank actually in the early stages tried to ghostwrite the local neoliberal reports, pretending they were written by local governments. However, they were seen through as a farcical hoax. And as Tandika pointed out, this was ultimately self-defeating as it bred cynicism and mistrust among the local counterparts. Ideas are most potent when they are completely internalized and owned by local experts. The solution was to provide local counterparts with the requisite skills and view them with the intellectual inclination that would enable them to own the hegemonic orthodoxy so that it comes naturally to them, so to speak. So let's talk a bit about how this actually happened. One of the most powerful mechanisms to demobilize opposition and shrink the parameters of policy space is to infuse academics, as Tandika pointed out, and policymakers with the same shared understanding of priorities, constructs, and theories to then build up the organizational structures and capacities within states with the sole mission of implementing neoliberal policies. Proponents of justice denigrated earlier generation of economists, blamed them for providing intellectual basis for the failed state efforts. Their economics was considered to be old-fashioned. They were condemned for lacking modern tools. The IMF knew this very early. And from the very early point, they started inviting central bank and Ministry of Finance officials. The IMF had by the 1950s, in essence, adopted the financial programming model, heavily relying on monetarist theory. It's a whole other discussion. And so by nature, had already adopted the whole notion of austerity and what became effectively pro-cyclical interventions. And they would bring them in for periods of time to learn that way. I used to see the transition of some people who spend a little time at the IMF. The World Bank was also aware of the issue of capacity building in vital areas like budget determination, debt payment capacity, and macroeconomic coordination. And not surprisingly, and virtually as being a student of structural adjustment and the loans, between 1970 and 1998, in virtually every loan, there was money put aside for capacity building to meet conditionality. An opportunity arose to do something much more fundamental. During the economic and social crisis of the late 70s, higher education institutions became arenas of social struggle with students protesting against government policies. Some governments became increasingly hostile to universities. They were seen as threats to stability and power. At the same time, the crisis in the late 70s pushed African governments to more dependent on agencies like the World Bank for financial support, just as neoliberal conditionality, and I've outlined this in great detail in the book I published in 2008, was hitting in and aimed at massive cuts in education as part of the austerity. The World Bank was particularly hostile to higher education. And I have read dozens and dozens of World Bank papers at that time. And frankly, they really should be tried for crimes against humanity with the way they simply said, you know what, Africa really doesn't need higher education. And if they need it, it should be done. It should be done. People should pay their own way. The government's got to stop supporting it. What you need is primary education, because we've shown that the net returns are higher based on their very problematic formulations in comparison to investing in higher education. This is exactly when the world was transforming towards IT, at a time when the world was becoming much less resource intensive and relying much more on intellectual capital. What ended up happening, Africa was pushed entirely away from that model. And you had a massive crisis in the universities. This is all very well documented. Everything I say here, by the way, can be empirically documented, but go ahead. Common sense would suggest that, if you want to expand primary education, you need school teachers. And for that, you need higher education. Whoops, that kind of escaped them. Enrollments in primary education were also completely dashed with austerity, imposing of user fees, and a huge shortage of teachers. And this was in African country after African country where this was imposed. Education fell to only 5.3% of the GDP after adjustment was imposed. The situation was much worse in higher education. The introduction of severe austerity of adjustment and growing antipathy for higher education by the World Bank and other donors really made the 80s and 90s a period of great crisis in African universities. Between 80 and 88, spending per student in higher education in Africa plummeted by more than 75%. It created profound problems on the campuses throughout Africa. There are protests in 150 different protests documented against the austerity and burdens imposed by structural adjustment and the attacks on academic freedom in 85 and 98. By 1991, my university, where I taught for 2 years in the 80s, the average monthly academic wages were down to only 3 days of subsistence as everything began to get liberalized and the cost of living went up and salaries did not. Instruments of research were not even affordable at that time, papers and pens. Austerity at individual institutional levels increasingly forced a great dependence on foreign agencies and donors. And this was a great opportunity to leverage this by the World Bank and change the nature of the training of economics to deal with the weaknesses in their education, weaknesses in quotation marks. And the whole role was in line with this broader capacity building effort that was put in place. So in 1991, the World Bank launched the African Capacity Building Initiative operating through the newly organized African Capacity Building Foundation, or ARI. See, there's a lot of history here, Edgar. Well, most people actually would argue that the greatest capacity Africa needed at that point was scientists, engineers, medical doctors. Instead, what was the focus of capacity building? Economic policy analysis and development management. The reason was quite clear because despite the achievements in education and training in Africa during the past 30 years, most countries still do not have a critical mass of top flight policy analysts and managers who can help pilot their economies through the storms and turbulence that must be faced daily. That is a quote from the capacity building project. Among other things, a key focal point was on the rehabilitation and improvement of departments of economics in selected national universities. Basically, while the efforts were comparatively small in terms of initial transformation in comparison to sort of the famous case of Chile with the Los Chicago boys that came in and hammered the economy in line with Pinochet, there was a development over time with local economists and personnel and central banks that got on board. New graduates of American and other Western universities of African countries welcomed the new approach to policy, joined in the chorus of condemnation, and became leaders in supporting macro stabilization adjustment. Emphasis was also on strengthening and building regional institutions of policy analysis, ministries of finance, basically with fellowships to try to build up and the development of local consultancy firms. The bank pointed to a successful approach to transforming economics. My dear old department of economics at the University of Dar es Salaam, beginning in 1979 with the so-called sandwich training, in which the economists got trained in Sweden at Lund University by neoclassical economists, and they ended up getting a local PhD. By 1991, there was a strong group of over a dozen professional economists at the University of Dar es Salaam, as pointed out in the capacity building project. This was the model to follow. Once again, I was involved with all these people. I knew everyone. And so what was needed, however, was a single organization with a resource to build an African-wide network of economists that would focus on neoclassical economics trained in place universities and key policy and ministries. The bank in its report hailed a newly formed initiative co-sponsored 3 years before in Nairobi as an example of the exact kind of successful capacity building network in economics. It's interesting because the idea of the ARC actually largely came originally from Jerry Leiner, my professor at the University of Toronto. You know, and I really don't think he thought the same way it worked out, because in many ways, I think from discussions, his view was we've got to build up the capacity of local economists to bargain with the World Bank, push back on some of the extreme positions. But the reality turned out very differently. I think he was naive in understanding how it would completely transform economics thinking, and in fact, get him on board to facilitate the transformation. And so his student he put in place actually was an IDRC grant, largely, and some other foundations. This guy Jeff Fine was his student at University of Toronto, so that's where that actually came from. He was the first head, and of course Benno Ndulu was the first head of research, and then became the head of it. My colleague at University of Dar es Salaam. So initially there was only modest budget of $1.3 million. It was initially able in its first 3 years to enhance the capabilities of individual researchers. Maybe a dozen universities, was still comparatively small scale. In reality, the research focused almost entirely in the initial phases. And one of the few people who's actually had read through all the working papers historically, what came out at that point, what was the focal point, and what was it focused on? Balance of payments and debt management, rather than agendas set by Africans. Every part of it was the agenda being set by the donors. Overall, the ARC, more than any other organization, has completely transformed the teaching and research in the African continent in support of the neoliberal project. The steep decline of the universities in the 80s, commitment of large sums of donor funds for domestically generated research initiative in the name of capacity building, created this whole new incentive system for African economists to find alternative sources for income for survival. And the idea of a single organization with the underlying capacity to build up a big network of neoclassical economic trained economists placed in university key policy ministries was desperately needed from the perspective of the donors and the World Bank. And from the beginning, in line with the capacity building project of the World Bank, the focus was, as suggested, entirely servicing neoliberal objectives. The first report of the commission by the ARC from an 8-country study in 1989 and graduate training not only the crisis in economics preference of the general problem in African communities, but the problems with the wrong education. Wrong meaning not consistent with the World Bank and the others wanted. The language to the linkage to the bank and IMF was there from the beginning. From the very first 10 years, the head of research and the executive director of the RC was Professor Benno Ndulu. He was recruited. Jerry knew Benno from his time of research in Tanzania. Benno came back just before I arrived and picked me up at the airport when I arrived at the University of Dar es Salaam after he was freshly trained from Northwestern University. And he was really one of the first PhDs trained in mainstream economic programs entirely. Northwestern is a completely neoclassical department. And following his term, he was awarded nicely with appointments to the World Bank from 1990 to 2008, including a role as advisor to the vice president of the partnership group in the Africa region in 2007. And of course, from 2008 to 2018, governor of the Central Bank of Tanzania. He also was, in the early 2000s, the representative of the World Bank to Tanzania. And I met with him when I was working on a project, when I worked for a project on aid ownership for CETA, the Swedish CETA. I was sitting there talking to him, interviewing, and it was kind of like, here was this guy who was an old friend of me, used to go beer drinking, and he had this whole World Bankish, perspective on talking what a wonderful job they were in controlling the financial system with this new platinum software that could follow exactly what the government was doing on all its spending. It was an amazing conversation. It was surreal. Anyway, the World Bank basically kept a close eye on the ARC. Often the chief economist of the World Bank was on the board, and they've been part of the consortium of donors who elect the board of directors. And from the beginning, the donors recognized the importance of the ARC for generating capacity in support of neoclassical economics and the neoliberal agenda. So in fiscal year 1999 to 2000, there was a dozen multilateral and bilateral donors, including the World Bank financing more than 80%. It was now up to an $8 million budget. By 2012 to 13, it was up to 17 million, and everybody was kicking in, including now the arrival of the Gates Foundation, who got on board with the importance of training in neoclassical economics. But everybody across the board. Once upon a time, groups like Danita and CETA would be supporting, the alternative social democratic model in the area, but now they're all on board with the same kind of neoliberal training. The World Bank and IMF have then used the ARC to build close links with economists in African countries. Those who have been involved in the conferences and reviewing research sponsored by ARC have been overwhelmingly mainstream economists, including many from the bank and fund. More than 150 economists have been part of the RC research network between 94 and 2016 that actually went on to be brought to the IMF program. So got additional inculcation of that particular view. The initial focus set out by the directors was on research grants to expand economic skills. 20 projects were launched within the first year in these two areas that I discussed in support of balance of payments, financial development. And additional themes were all added after 1997. They were all neoliberal themes: external balance, macro management, trade policy, regional integration, external debt management, domestic remobilization, all theorized within the neoliberal framework. And then finally, they started talking about poverty, because all of a sudden, in 1999, the World Bank and IMF kind of rediscovered poverty. So all of a sudden, the IMF started calling it a structural adjustment facility. Oh no, we're not going to call it that. We're going to call it the Poverty Reduction Growth Facility, better known as old wine in a new bottle. And so even then, okay, and I've studied some of this. Well, now you guys can talk about poverty, which was not permitted to talk about beforehand. The research cycles of 18 months involved careful vetting process in all three stages: proposal, work in progress, and final report. There were presentation of these stages of the biennial research workshop. Emphasis was on mainstream methodology, buttressed with plenary workshops on methodology at meetings. Rather than original research, the vast majority was simply to discover novel empirical research. It was discovering much of it, like so much we see today in economics, is showing you can be a neoclassical economist rather than actually providing new insight into the world. The rewards for staying with this program was high. During this 1977-2003 period, average spending was $5,000 per student. Grants were for completed projects ranged from $10,000 to $19,000, massively above what your local salary was being paid at. This was a huge bribe to participate, and get inculcated. Compare that at the time in the 90s of per capita incomes in Africa, $300 to $500. Huge amounts of sums of money. A review of the ARC research papers is illustrated of the nature of the work. The overall focus of the papers are on neoliberalism, including orthodox macro stabilization, fiscal imbalances, deregulating banking regulations, real interest rates, real exchange rate movements, parallel markets, and monetary policy. And the ARC then provided also direct financial support to economics departments with large grants. A number of African countries organized master's coursework along Western lines, all completely constructed in the same mechanisms and the same methods that we see in typical Western universities: macroeconomics, microeconomics, quantitative methods, with careful vetting of the syllabi of the course material, how carefully controlled. Make sure you don't have any articles by Makerere or Stein on the syllabus. Okay. The ARC flow of dollars was a huge inducement for African economists department that have been subject to severe austerity to participate in the programs. Training was increasingly in neoclassical economics, which has become the main focal point of the activities. In 2010, the Collaborative Masters Program for Anglophone Africa also involved 21 universities in 16 African countries. The contents of the program was very similar to any standard economics programs anywhere in the West. Consisted of 12 months of macro, micro, and quantitative, and 14 weeks of elective courses at Nairobi, by bringing in carefully vetted teachers to make sure it was all neoclassical, including the standard econometrics, game theory, and international economics. The ARC impact has been ubiquitous. More than 2,000 students from 25 countries in the CMAP program alone between 93 and 2013 who took JFE courses. In addition, there were 260 students in the collaborative program who also took JFE courses. Between 1991 and 2012, we estimated supported more than 3,000 economic researchers in 35 sub-Saharan African countries. They also had a comparable Francophone program. It's very difficult to quantify the impact of the measure of the ARC in changing the plane of policy making in Africa over the past 30 years. Basically, ARC's received, in my estimate, over $200 million to alter the train of the economic interests of economists, aligned closely with the World Bank and the donor agenda. They've made a conscious effort over time to increase their impact on policymakers and institutionalize a network of ARC training economists. All sorts of other institution beating capacity go on, some of which I ran across when we were doing our project on aid ownership for CETA, bringing in groups like Adam Smith Institute from Australia to teach people in international trade to see things about the necessity of liberalizing everything. There was a key focal point of phase 5 of their operations covering 2001 to 2003. And as one review by Hassan Arampal specified, it was to build and maintain the network and expand their influence. Beyond successful capacity building dimensions that place ARC economists, they pointed to the wider area of influence of activities was drawing their comparative advantage as economic experts. And meant working closely on projects with other African international based agencies, designing key people in the African institutions like the central bank as AARC research fellows. So organizing national policy workshops and higher level senior policy seminars involved well-known seminars, well-known scholars. Basically, the biggest impact was the creation of really, and some would argue, an interconnected community of neoclassical economists in the continent, exhibiting what a former head of the ARC noted: esprit de corps evident in ARC's thematic research driven by a peer review mechanism. The program review of 97-2003 came to a similar conclusion. ARC created a community of African researchers across the continent. This was done by getting people to collaborate or produce more research, but by creating what I would argue common constructs of understanding. The typical output, to quote Billy Okura, my former colleague from University of Dar es Salaam, of an ARC is a person and not just a paper or a book. However, in a good article I'd recommend done by Grieve Chelwa, he points out that this reorientation towards the West does not mean African-based economists have participated in the creation of knowledge of Africa that has informed generations of policy. So, in his view and his documentation, there was not a single African-based author on the influential World Bank Research Observer, though more than 10% of all its articles between 2005 and 15 were in Africa. This is partly due to what is, in essence, he argues, is the extroversion of the profession. The knowledge produced by African researchers about the content is extroverted in the sense that it's an outward-facing a focal point, produced mainly for the consumption of the North. It leads to a form of scientific dependence whereby African research are always dependent on the North for their market for their ideas, their scientific wares, and crucially for their modes of inquiry, research questions, theoretical frameworks, laboratory apparatus. But scientific dependence of clearinghouses for what constitutes legitimate knowledge is really done through the Northern journals. African researchers are therefore likely to be published if their work conforms to North's idea of Africa. And hence they end up having to mimic Northern researchers who would study their own content. In order to have any sort of success, have to study their own content within that particular framework. They're bound to fail, however, as Grieve points out, and Grieve is a Zambian economist currently teaching at New School. They're bound to fail, not in the least because they do not have the same command over research resources as the North. To Grieve, the implications are profound. African scholars are virtually absent from the debates and ultimately share development scholarship and policy about the continent. And so they're kind of absent from it. The underrepresentation of African voices have profound some of the gross policy areas, he argues, might have been avoided had the circles of consensus been extended to include voices on the continent. But as Makerere pointed out, the institutionalization of economics, with its overemphasis on stabilization economics, has created a profound capacity problem as African countries try to transcend the neoliberal era and progress into phase 3, which was still neoclassical, but a broader set of issues. And as he argues, the forced process of displacement of old capacity and with the new had disastrous effects in terms of the ability of governments to deal with the crisis, rendering them less able to formulate their own positions, negotiate an equal footing with the IFIs. Today, governments complain they cannot find economists to help them draw up the new national plans, facilitate their access to global financial markets, or evaluate projects in which they can invest their newly acquired wealth in productive activities. As one minister put it, all they say is that we should strengthen our reserve position or set up sovereign funds, nothing about how we can productively use them for national development. But the situation is much more profound than that. It has led to African-focused errors, omissions, incapacities, and I'd argue gross negligence. Let me close at least with one example. It's a whole series of lectures I could give on all of those 4 things, but let me give one example. A key characteristic of the global financial architecture is the hierarchy of currencies in the world. It's helped determine how countries interact with the global economy. Unfortunately, for a very long period, Africa finds itself at the very bottom of the hierarchy with currencies that are unstable, with no international circulation, under constant pressure to accumulate dollars, which, as we see at this moment, still does not allow African countries to avoid a massive debt crisis, which we're currently in a number of countries. Commodity price shocks create balance of payments crisis, forcing governments to turn to the IMF, which has become the lender of last resort and was placed at the very center for reasons I have outlined in my book in the early 80s when adjustment lending was starting. Loans have been conditional on continuously pro-cyclical policies such as fiscal austerity and interest rate increases. Poor countries obviously then go to great lengths to avoid going to the IMF for financial support during a crisis by increasing hard currency reserves in the US dollar when times are good. Expanding foreign exchange reserves then can hypothetically allow you to provide resources to help diversify your economies away from commodity dependence. However, the pressing need for reserves pushes governments to expand commodity exports when prices are high to accumulate reserves to defend themselves from the IMF and to finance vital imports when prices fall. And it creates what I call a vicious cycle of commodity dependence, where dependence on commodities creates the conditions that keep you dependent on commodities. Let me put up one slide with data on the export structure of African economies from the United Nations from UNCTAD. I've been very good as an economist, not doing any data so far. So here you can see virtually no transformation in the structure of trade in African countries. If you look at 1995, and you go back historically, and up to the current point, you have virtually no change. Basically, you're looking at 89 to 92% of the economy still reliant on exports of unprocessed raw materials. That's a disaster for a whole series of reasons. The big recovery after 2000 and the rise of reserves, if I had more time, I'd throw more data up at you, really was from that accumulating process when the prices went up. It was a boom period, but the period of the 1990s was a disaster because before, I would argue, you had this huge movement away from resource intensity and production. You had a situation in which the prices dropped dramatically in the 80s and 90s in Africa for the commodities, creating the crisis in the late 90s. And then what ended up happening was a recovery. And the recovery, by the way, had less to do with changing nature of supply and demand, and I've shown this in other papers, and there's a lot of documentation, but actually the huge growth of concentration of wealth that utilizes commodities as speculation. And so you then get periods of boom and bust depending on the vicissitudes of the flows going into speculation in the commodity markets. And that came out of the deregulation in 1990, 2000 under the Clinton regime, which they stopped restrictions on speculation in the commodity markets and a massive increase in derivatives. This is all can be documented empirically. And it's a disaster for Africa because they have no control over the actual nature of the prices they're getting. There are price takers in these commodities. And it's been driven by speculation and the huge concentration of wealth, which then ends up driving the upward or downward of prices, depending on the vicissitudes as its linkage to this other forms of speculation. It's the concentration of massive amounts of hedge funds and others that are managing this wealth. And this is all, again, fortunately, we're starting to get really good studies on global wealth coming out. And what we can see is virtually no transformation of manufacturing, and I would put up comparative tables of Southeast Asia, which went through the manufacturing transition, got off the dependence in Southeast Asia with huge improvements in the standard of living. But as you can see, Africa by 2008 had fallen to only 6.8% of its exports and manufacturing. And with that, there's no value added. And what you see then is basically expansion at various times of exports without a comparable increase in value added. It doesn't generate jobs and continue. And so the system then generates financial subordination. Well, at the same time, the holding of vast amounts of reserves actually contributes to dollar hegemony. The United States gets a massive free ride. And I'm just finishing a paper on that, on economic, financial, and military advantages, because there's no constraint on its monetary policy, on its fiscal policy, because it does not have to worry about accumulating other reserves because it is the global currency. And to this day, if you look at the statistics and data, that hegemonic position is still there over the last 20, 25 years. That's existed for a long time. It was originally embedded in the Bretton Woods system, but neoliberalism, that's a whole other lecture, changed the nature of the mechanism by which the dollar's hegemonic position continued. And within that is also the enormous financial subordination of African countries that have to continually play this game trying to accumulate hard currency in a system which they do not control. So neoclassical economists, what do? Well, they tend to blame the weakness and lack of exchangeability on lesser developing countries themselves. Their poorly developed financial systems, the weak institutional capacities, their macro mismanagement, and hence really have no solutions. Because in fact, countries that have done this have gone nowhere in Africa. Nothing has changed after decades of African countries attempting to follow these strategies, since the problem is systemic and structural. If anything, this approach feeds into and buttresses a system of subordination. The ability to break out a system really requires another set of economic constructs, a whole other set of different theory. And what's, of course, absolutely central to that is both understanding the sources of power that perpetuate the system and identify where that power can be contested. That would be the subject of at least another lecture. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that robust prosecution or
Let's hear the defense.
Economics. We're very lucky to have with us Dr. Kavuma for as a discussant for the presentation, and so I'll just hand over directly to Dr. Kavuma for as long as you'd like, really, but please go, and you'll have to use.
Are we gonna have an opportunity for some broader questions also? You take questions from the audience, or?
Yeah, there will be questions after
Okay.
after the discussion. Then there will be, we'll open to questions. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I need it. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Stein. This is a very good discussion of the neoclassical theory and the propagation of the theory in Africa. I read your article and it was very interesting. It has very interesting ideas. And I agree with most of them. And I thank you for your contribution to literature. But as introduced mainly from the economics background. And so I'll try my best to provide as much text as I can, because we normally drill more with the figures.
I was pretty good about that too. So.
And, the words are sometimes relatively fewer than our counterparts in social science. Okay. So I read your paper and I agree with you that monoeconomics is problematic because societies are different geographically, but also with time. So we must put into consideration those differences, the geographical differences, because societies are structured differently. And with time also, that many things change over time. And we cannot expect to begin the development of our economies at the same time or path with our developed counterparts. The developed countries started at a much earlier time before there was even ICT as we see it today. Now we have to develop in this knowledge era. And so a lot has changed. So monoeconomics cannot hold. And yes, I agree with you, many of the criticisms you've given for the neoclassical theory. Yeah, of course, it has strict assumptions and it dwells a lot on rationality. Although over time, we've improved the rationality aspect to include bonded rationality that, it all depends on somebody's information set that needs to be factored in the analysis as you develop the analysis of the theory. And I agree with you that economic theory, as well as instruction, dwells more on prediction. Economists, we are very good at modeling. We model, and most times our emphasis is more on prediction. The predictive power of your model, to what extent can it predict? And I agree with you that it has really been a major focus. And this is also partly driven by our counterparts in the North that have tended to emphasize that. Even the journals themselves tend to focus on that more than solving a problem. So the rigor is more on the methodology you've used, but not so much of what the problem you're addressing is and how you're contributing to solving the problem. Normally, there is more emphasis on the rigor on the methodology used, and therefore that has shaped the thinking, the instruction, and the research outputs because of the emphasis on the methodologies that we use. You rightly point out that our donor community contributed to the problem of the low years of schooling, if I can say, in African countries, because of the shift in their priorities that they tended to emphasize primary education as opposed to university education. And actually, we see most of the countries in Africa, the average years of schooling are very low. And that has been very problematic. And then when you look at Uganda itself, we have a double problem because the World Bank made a shift, an emphasis to primary education, but over time, they now say we've over invested in education, and therefore the focus has been shifted from education to infrastructure. Now it has shifted to infrastructure, but causing another problem because Uganda has one of the highest dropout rates, primary dropout rates, because we say it's only about 38% of pupils who join primary who complete primary education. And so many fall off, and so there is less, critical mass of scholars who can help in the development process. So I agree with you that yes, there is a problem that our donor community has created, and it's likely to stay for even in the short term because they eventually shifted from even funding education to other priorities. And then true, I agree with you that despite the donor assistance, in institutionalizing neoclassical economics, Africa has continued to face all host of challenges. And you rightly mentioned our poor integration in the global market, that up to today, we are so dependent on the commodity exports that have limited component of manufacturing, which is a big challenge. And I might say that, yes, you rightly point out that the neoclassical economics mainly looked at the macro aspect. When you look at really the structure of these theories, they may tend to concentrate on the macro, stabilizing the economy. How best can you stabilize the economy? And Uganda has done this very well for a very long time. Before COVID, really, our targeting was very efficient. We would really target at 5% inflation rate. But then you ask yourself, how about how productive is the economy? Is it creating jobs? Because I think now Uganda has a very big problem of unemployment. We have this labor externalization that is taking most of our students, the labor force, the young. It includes both the dropouts from school, but also the graduates that we're exporting because we don't have the labor market to absorb them. And maybe that is partly because of how the policies we've implemented that have tended to over focus on stabilizing the economy and meeting all these monetary objectives and fiscal, not so much. And so we've been challenged that our economies are not holistically looking at all these economic objectives beyond just like stabilizing the economy. But maybe we need to say that, this propagation of the neoclassical economics is part of the neo-colonialism, part of the neo-colonialism. And then, and also it's a challenge because our student will only be as good as the teacher, oftentimes. And so what you've been told is what you go out there to practice. But also he who pays the piper tends to dictate the tune. And so you're paid to study, and then you're also paid to manage your economy. And so perhaps you have less flexibility in what you're doing. As a way of critiquing, first of all, I'm of the view that maybe you've underrated the benefits of these donor assistance. I don't know, maybe partly because I have a bit of conflict of interest because I'm a product, I'm a product of this investment in African scholars, because I was funded for my master's program and the Africa Capacity Building program, and funded by World Bank. And I might say that, this donor assistance came to address some of the constraints, because we still have funding constraints that perhaps without these funds, we'll not be able to have this critical mass of scholars that that have been, trained over time, over all these years. I'm one of them, a product of that kind of assistance. But also these platforms and these collaborations provide a link between the South and the North scholars, which is good, because we tend to share experiences and learn from others, because Uganda is a developing country and we are aspiring to get to where the developed countries have reached, and therefore we we try to compare what they've done in those more developed countries and us. And then when you look at the programs for training of these African development capacity building initiatives, there is a component of mentorship, and the ARC tends to match researchers from the South and the North, which helps in training and learning of methodologies that are useful in analyzing different research topics and issues. So I think there was a bit of contribution that we do really appreciate that was done in African economies and through universities and through these collaborative initiatives like ARC. That said, when we look at the neoclassical economic theory, the neoclassical theory is just like all other theories. There is no perfect theory. There is no perfect theory. Every theory has limitations. Every theory has limitations, and actually, because of the limitations of theories, that has led to the development of more theories. If you look at economics, it has had an evolution of economic theory over time. And this is mainly motivated by the limitations of the preceding theory. We started off with the classical that was more concentrated on cost of production. Then you go to the neoclassical, they say, okay, now there's individual preferences. And then you move on to Keynes, who tend to look more on aggregate demand. And then you get to say, you know what, the Washington consensus is over concentrating on the free market economy, about neglected institutions, and then you get into institutionalization. So I think that is that's how knowledge evolves, and that's how knowledge is built over time. And so I think that the major problem is really not the propagation of the neoclassical theories, but maybe the lack of imagination. And I must say, you pointed it out in your article. I think I read it, that the biggest problem we have now is the lack of imagination of scholars. What you've given these tools, these theories are tools. They're tools you're supposed to use, and there is need to have imagination and think beyond this tool that you've been given, this theory that has these assumptions. Try to critique the assumptions and see how you can conduct research that addresses some of these assumptions, limitations of a theory. So I think there is need to emphasize the need to have scholars that are imaginative and are able to extend the frontiers of knowledge. Okay, so now this neoclassical economics or neoclassical theory has all these challenges. Should we do away with it, or what is the way forward? My thinking is that, well, it has some good ideas. It has some good ideas, because personally I believe that the concept of rationality is important. It is important and it drives behavior. It really drives behavior. We only have to understand that, well, that improvement, that it's bonded and people are rational based on the information sets they have. And, maybe resources at their disposal. So those are the improvements we need to make as we think of also other theories. I don't know, I wanted to just supplement that, by the works of Botel et al. Of 2008, it suggests that contemporary economics can be characterized by three features. The first one is that we now have to, as economists, we have to search for solutions elsewhere. That is the political economy. You know, as economists, we need to know we can't run away from political economy. And actually, when you look at the evolution of economics over time, you see that in the 1776, you know, in the 18th century, you know, our fathers of economics like Adam Smith, in their ideas, in their ideologies, they had a lot of political economy embedded in it, and moral philosophy. Karl Marx, who came up and brought up those ideas. Of course, it has evolved over time, and it must have been because of a critique. They were also critiqued that maybe there was so much dwelling on the political economy and the social morals, and then eventually we have it transitioning to a technical science, where now we get economics or economists who are more minded about the tools, the modeling, you know, the mathematical aspects of economics, and then we get it maybe embedded with a bit of social constructs, you know, behavior, what determines an individual's behavior, a consumer's behavior, you know, and the supplier's behavior. But we are increasingly, I think we're seeing that we're going back to now also consider the political economy, which should also answer these other questions we have. And I think that is the whole essence of institutionalizing, institutional economics, that tends to point out that now we need to look at the political structure that also influences behavior and determines how economies grow. So I think we now need to emphasize the role of empirical evidence and not only just theorizing. We have these theories, let's test them. We need to encourage, you know, empirical work so that we test these theories, go out there and test them, modify them, have new ones, come up with new ones, and extend the frontiers of knowledge. Of course, Africa has a challenge because our expenditure on research is minimal, is very limited, and we still get funding from the donors. And as I mentioned before, that he who pays the piper often dictates the tune. And so that's a limitation, but we need to really focus on empirical work that should inform theory building. Then lastly, to promote what is called now freakonomics. And this simply refers to the aspect of thinking out of the box and thinking of new innovative ways. I think that's where we need to move to and begin to get these unorthodox topics. You know, how do you relate crime with earnings? How do you relate abortion with crime? Etc. So that, you know, we get economics addressing real issues. And I think that's why increasingly now behavior economics has become so popular that, you know, it tends to really tackle real problems that everybody identifies with in society. So we need to appreciate them. And I think as economists, we are also broadening our understanding. In the past, if you're not doing research in macroeconomics, you were considered not to be made in the mainstream. They could look at you as if you're not a mainstream economist. But increasingly, I think we're changing and becoming less orthodox and considering new topics that really touch on the problems that societies are facing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those comments, and I think I'll just turn it directly back to Professor Stein before we open up the floor for broader questions. Yeah.
Thanks. I really appreciate you reading the paper carefully, and appreciate your remarks. You know, and I appreciate your yes, I like it, but you know, and let me deal with some of the buts. Okay, because I still think there's some fundamental disagreements here, you know, that's very problematic. And let me try to respond to some of the points that you've made. Begin with, to say, oh, we need time to develop, it completely misses what is a massive literature critical of the way economies are operating and the way economic theory operates, and of neoclassical economics. The biggest problem is, I completely agree with you. No particular approach theoretically has all the answers. But what is necessary is open-mindedness. So I would ask, how many of your classes at Makerere in economics know what post-Keynesian economics is? How many know what institutional economics is? Not the new institutional economic nonsense, the real institutional economics. There's huge literature in this area covering so many of these topics. How many are familiar with Marxian economics? How many are familiar with structural economics? And there are absolutely insights into all of these fields. But the problem, it is not taught. It's doctrinaire right now. There is no criticism. How many of your classes sit there and get up and say, we have this structural problem internationally, and we need to maybe think about what's wrong with existing policy domain and rethink an alternative set of constructs and theories to be able to deal with it and come up with an alternative approach. And it doesn't happen. I know what goes on. And many times when I've lectured, and once I lectured, at Baden University in the economics department, I ripped apart structural adjustment and its theoretical basis. The only response that came back at the time was, and there was a lot of graduate students, was a professor said, "Hope you guys don't give me a hard time now." That was it. Nothing changes. I spent quite a bit of time trying to convince the economics department of the University of Dar es Salaam to open up, to be able to begin to working with some others to say, let us have a different set of PhD advisors that can push these people doing research with alternative approaches. It's not going to happen. They barely had a conversation with me. I've tried, including well-connected people, to try to change things. I put my time into it. It's not there. And the reason why is because people have this one way of looking at the world in economics, and they think that's the only way. And sadly, because it's a lack of education, but it's more than that. It is, as I've argued, it's a model of inculcation. It's a model of, in essence, an ideological paradigm that sees this way of looking at the world. And they say, oh, then we should do it. Oh, well, Freakonomics. Well, Freakonomics doesn't do much for me. It's still neoclassical economics, trying to think a little bit outside the box. And that gets into the issue of, that gets into a number of other issues. So one of the issues is your comment that, well, economists just do much modeling and too much prediction of the future. But they don't realize that the biggest problem with that is it's based on in essence, the work of Milton Friedman. And his argument was with logical positivism, it's not really, it doesn't matter how ridiculous the assumptions are, as long as we can predict the future with it. And that led to the whole issue, which is very problematic and not critically evaluated. I could go on and on, so I'll try to cut it short. And it's the very nature of the empirical work which transpires, because much of the empirical, and I've argued this with my neoclassical colleagues, I said, how many times do you guys reject the hypothesis? Much of what you end up doing is, in fact, the process of verification of the system, and sitting there and manipulating and playing games with the data to get the results you want to then prove that was the case. And this goes on and on and on. How many journals end up publishing in economics the wrong hypothesis to say, hey, this doesn't actually exist? It isn't. It's a process of confirmation and the process of the buttressing of the existing paradigm, and that's what transpires right now. And even though people don't know it's wrong, and then your comment basically of political economy. Unfortunately, political economy, there is models of political economy in mainstream economics. It's called public choice. Political economy is all about combining politics and economics, but then what do you end up using? The same flawed methodological individualist rational deductive analysis to explain why states don't operate, and then with it, the corruption and the rent seeking, and what is very problematic that is that you bring in with it so much baggage when you're doing evaluation, because you don't know, economists simply don't know the way of looking at the world, and then they reject people like myself as saying, oh, well, it's ideological, your position. No, my work is empirical, strongly empirical. But without the presuppositions of trying to then simply reproduce a system of economics that actually then looks at it and then kind of reconfirms the existing hypothesis. So it's a long discussion on methodology, but it's right now it is extremely difficult. And even trying to change any economics department, open up. I know all of the former heads of the ARC up to recently. Billy Okura, Delphin Regasira. And do I've been through Nairobi on many occasions and said, I'm willing to lecture on something else. I said, please train these people in other ways of looking at the world. It never happened. And it wasn't going to happen because the people that actually then controlled it at the high level, the donors, they had a message, they had a focal point, and it was going to try to reproduce economics the way it is in the North. And that's what exists right now. And it's a sad state of affairs because it's not just imagination, it's inculcation. That in some senses people see the world in a particular way. And part of that is, as I've argued in another paper, it's also about the idea of the market. There's this kind of embedded notion, oh look, it's maximizing utility. How can you interrupt it? You've got Pareto, you have Pareto optimality. How can you operate that? How can you disrupt that process? And that's the real problem. Also, is there's then a strong ideological focal point, which is then embedded in the theory. Anyway, it's a long conversation. I really appreciate you reading everything carefully, but there's still some very serious points of agreement. And once again, I would offer your economics department a different syllabus with a different set of readings, and I sit there and I challenge you to incorporate that into your program. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And so as the floor is now open to questions from both online and in the room, I'm going to try to avoid being a typical historian chair and asking my 5 questions all at once. But just so the floor is open, just for those online, you can put it in the chat or use the raise hand button and I'll get to you. I might just start by this aspect of the first of my 5 questions on, maybe, and for both Professor Stein and Dr. Kavuma, about in economics, the relationship between empirical training and theoretical training. It's something that in the humanities, the defense of the humanities under the same neoliberalization of the university, which is privileged STEM and certain social sciences above the humanities, has been that, well, there needs to be a theoretical framework for empirical historical research. And often what that means is, in graduate training, the theoretical framework section will have whoever it is. Here's Foucault, here's Marx, here's whoever the theorist is, and then it presents, prepackages often rich empirical research as simply a way to test a European theorist's model, rather than trying to develop new insights and so on. So I think from the discussion here, is it the absence of what is the kind of theoretical research that would lead to innovations in a way out of a stagnant kind of theoretical landscape as you're proposing? I mean, what kind of empirical research is needed both to supplement what exists? I mean, I take Professor Stein's point that there's an existing literature that could offer, a different set of, different syllabi, different ways of thinking. But if it's going to be developed from within African universities, a way out of this model, what is the kind of empirical research that in economics that would help to generate new theoretical innovations outside? Yeah.
I spoke last.
Sure. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Professor, for giving me the opportunity to speak first. Well, first of all, research is supposed to be an iterative process and a cycle. And you rightly say, if research is academic and also targeting all these highly ranked journals, it should have a theoretical framework in which it follows. But we now need to be transparent and be able to point out, because Stein mentioned that sometimes, we stage hypotheses, but you can propose propose a hypothesis, use the data, and it can be rejected. You know, and if it is rejected, that should be the starting point of questioning the theory you've used. Okay, so is the problem with the context, or it's about how this theory is built and assumptions? Okay, and actually that's how knowledge is expanded, that you realize that, okay, we have a theory, but because of a certain assumption, it cannot work in a certain context, which takes us back that, you know, monoeconomics may not be ideal because we need to apply all these theories to different contexts. And then we should be open and bold enough. And maybe that is a challenge, as Professor Stein has mentioned, that, you know, it's a challenge because we have different objectives. For example, academics, the objective is to ensure that you publish in the highly ranked journal. And of course, it has methodologies that it adheres to. And as African scholars, we have a challenge because if it is an African scholar who is first identifying the failure of this theory, it is to be questionable. Who are you? Who are you? Because it's normally taken that, you know, the authorities are in the south, in the north, not from the south. So that's a challenge, but ideally, we should be open enough to let the data speak and be able to boldly come up and say, this, we got a different result from what we expected in either the direction or magnitude of a certain variable.
It's a long discussion, but let me kind of very briefly respond. Basically, when you're doing empirical research, you need to have a hypothesis. You need to have some notion ahead of time, you know, or it could come from preliminary work. It's giving an idea of things. The biggest problem is that you end up seeing the data through a lens, theoretically. And that's the great problem with neoclassical economics, is when you go out and they do empirical research, it's often through a lens. And the lens and their understanding of the notion arises from the constructs of how you yourself are doing the research and how you're reading the empirical work. How are you looking at the data? What does it mean? You know, and so it's very much in some sense ordered by the constructs you're using. And so that's the greatest problem now. And until we begin to open up our minds to a whole variety of different theoretical approaches, instead of being stuck in one paradigm, the empirical route is not going to help very much. And the other thing that needs to be done is we need to begin focusing on what are the problems. Are the problems one in which there's too much regulation? Are the problems one in which are the problems one in which we don't have a good enforcement of contracts? Or is the problem that people can't get access to finance? And how do we deal with that to be able to change things? Let's say if we want to support the private sector, what can we do to accommodate that? Well, we have a real problem which is very fundamental. That's even to some extent understood and among more open-minded neoclassical economists, is you have a problem of, is banks don't really like to lend to risky entrepreneurs. Why? Because information, because the risks are too high, they won't get it back. But we know the greatest benefits for employment generation is then the idea that that you're investing in new areas that are in fact going to create new jobs and expand the domain, not that which is just sort of acceptable, well connected. And so instead they say, well, let's just harden all the property rights to the neoclassicals. Let's just make sure that information is improved. Instead of saying what is the fundamental problem of the nature of these completely underdeveloped markets, which is an institutional construct. So again, part of the problem is how you frame things is incredibly important to how you gather research. And the extant problems that are seen are very much driven by the theoretical framework you're working in. So you can't, very difficult to separate this.
So is the issue about disciplinarity, or is it about, is the is it about, so there's I'm just thinking here, there's actually, maybe I could ask Monica again to, if you'd like to make your there's a comment in the chat here. I don't know if Monica, if you'd like to just add your comment.
Thank you, Edgar, for the opportunity. Well, I'm not very conversant with economics, but I've had a brief background with economic anthropology. And I thought that if this is introduced, especially to the undergraduate students as an introductory course, it will broaden their thinking and it will interest them into looking at behavior anthropology. Yeah, that was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think, just before we started, Dr. Kavum and I were talking, there's a course on, history of economics, where presumably students would have to know about Marx and, other economic traditions. But I wonder, is the problem you're discussing, is it fundamental to the way the discipline has developed as a discipline? Or is it, because my inclination would be, a history, kind of historians approach to economics would have to understand how this became orthodoxy in the first place, as the first step in unraveling it. But if what you're sort of saying is that the model is so overwhelming within the discipline that no one's allowed to think out of it, is this an unsolvable problem? Or is there something in the history of economics, like is the way economics was taught in the 1970s, do we have to sort of rewind time and then move forward again? Because you're sounding, the way you framed it is that it's not like an individual choice. Like somebody can't just sort of individually choose to be outside the paradigm, because then what they do doesn't make sense to the logic of the discipline anymore.
If you don't want to get a job, then you can do that. First of all, Monica, thank you very much. I have enormous regard for economic anthropology. And in fact, in 2015, organized, I'm in what we call heterodox economics, which is acceptance of a lot of other economic theories outside of the orthodoxy, neoclassical economics. And my dear friend for many years was Jane Geyer. The two of us put together a conference at LSE on her 50th anniversary from graduating at LSE, on a conversation between economic anthropologists and heterodox economics. And there's enormous amounts of learning that can come from the other disciplines. And I would argue a lot of the best economics today and understanding of the world is not being done by economists who are overwhelmingly neoclassical, but is being done by economic anthropologists and by historians and by geographers. By far the best development work is being done by geographers today, because they're not constrained by a single paradigm. They can draw on whatever they need to understand the extant problems of the world, and they tend to have much greater insights. So I completely agree, Monica. It would be great. I think it'd be very good for every economics introductory class to require not only micro or macro, if that's what they want to do, and I have problems the way it's taught, but of course in economic anthropology, it would open their eyes. I agree completely with you.
And to answer Taylor's question, that yes, we have this neoclassical theory or economics. Can we do away with it? I think I mentioned that economic theory has evolved over time. And every theory, there's no perfect theory that is going to give you all the answers. It has limitations. And that's how, economic theory has evolved over time. Another theory comes up to address the weakness, the major weakness in the previous one. But if I can say that why neoclassical economics has shaped economic thinking over a long period of time, it's because of its central theme of rationality, issues to do with utility, maximizing utility. Because just as Professor Stein was speaking and saying, understanding economic behavior, I don't know how I would understand economic behavior without relating it to maximizing utility on the side of the consumer. Similarly, on the side of the producer, I don't know how I would understand the behavior of a producer without relating it to maximizing profit. So I believe that there are major principles that the theories put forward that we draw on, but I'm not saying that it's the only theory that you can look at. And Professor Stein mentioned that, beyond the theory, and I mentioned that the research process is iterative. There is the issue of the problem, there is the issue of the methodology and the data that you're using. So for us, really, we need now, because what is the interest? As I mentioned that in the past, scholars were more driven by the rigorous method you're using. This is a tool, this is a theory, you want to use it. How rigorously have you used it? But maybe now we need to change. And if your focus is solving a problem, so that would be the starting point. This is the problem. Unemployment in Uganda, or youth unemployment in Uganda. What theory can help me really analyze this kind of data that I have? Okay, because theory is a tool, just as we see a computer, and there are many tools over there that you have behavior economics, you have institutional economics, Keynesian. So you pick on a tool and say, okay, this is what I'm going to use for my problem because these are my objectives. And so this is the most appropriate tool I'm going to use, and then you employ it.
Okay. So I have a lot of problem with that. Okay. Basically, and this points to Edgar, right? As a notion that, well, aren't we teaching history of thought? They've stopped teaching history of thought for decades. And in fact, where do the ideas of this narrow notion of rationality come from? Where do the ideas of homo economicus come from? Where do the idea of utility maximization come from? Well, they're not new ideas. They are old ideas. They are from Jeremy Bentham, and they're from Karl Menger. These are people writing, with the Austrian school in the 19th century. And the problem is that economists today are taught, they think this is the cat's meow. This is the advance of the field. No, I would argue it's retrogressive and it's ideological. And to sit there and say, well, rationality, that's what we should be focusing on. How do we know people's behavior without talking about individual maximization? It's a completely wrong analysis because people are social beings. They're in fact then very much affected by the way they are in their context. Their behavior is very, very much contingent on who they are and who they're interacting with, and to come up with some kind of universal notion. So why did they choose this approach, economics? Well, because, rationality is very useful for mathematics. It was part of the equilibrium analysis that went forward. You start dealing with without a single notion of behavior, you have a real problem with math, because it's very hard to come up with that. And so they come up with behavioral economics. What's my problem with behavioral economics? There's a long list of things. But one of them is it's all anchored on the notion of rationality. And if somehow you're not rational, there's something wrong here. We have to find people to edge back into this ideal view. That's not who human beings are. Anybody who has read social psychology knows that's not what human beings are. But the biggest problem is that economists don't understand social psychology. They're not reading social psychology, or they're mining the areas of social psychology which are useful for them. So I would argue that the biggest problem is that you can make the argument, oh, look, this is a great addition because economics only progresses, but in fact, it's massive retrogression. And part of what you do is when you begin to embed it in the history of economic thought, you then realize where these ideas came from. They're not new, but the interesting part is how it became dominant. And why it gets so institutionalized. And that gets into the other point, which I think is important to emphasize, which is economists spend a lot of time investing themselves in learning this stuff and learning the mathematics. It's not easy for people. There's a whole set of apparatus and tools they learn, and they live in it, and then they defend it. And how can you get rewarded at a higher price? You make it opaque. You make it extremely difficult to get into. It's a big training session, and then you demand a large salary for it to be part of that. Look, I'm technical. I can do all this math. You can't understand what I'm doing. One of my political science colleagues that I did a project on looking at banking deregulation in Nigeria, he was a political science. He said, it's not fair. He said, you understand all we write, but I can't understand what you guys are writing because it's so mathematical. So it's a very important thing on how this is created and how it's reproduced, and its underlying embedded utility in the reproduction of knowledge and how it's controlled within the neoclassical economic paradigm. Sorry.
We have historical economists or economic historian in the room, so
that's a
we'll
difference.
pass it over to-
I'm not an economist who's interested in history, but I'm a historian who's interested in economic development. So, but I do work in an economics department. So I'm a trained historian in an economics department. So this is a very interesting conversation to attend and to listen into. But I'm also a little bit confused because I mean, the way I see it as an outsider with only a partial view, because I mostly work with agricultural, environmental, and development economists. And the development economists are very interested in randomized controlled trials, so a specific type of development economics. But I get the impression that sort of theory has been removed from economics altogether. So I don't see this sort of ideological narrowing. Maybe I miss it, but I have the impression that it's become more about method, mathematical approaches, the ability to identify causal developments, and that the broader questions that economists used to ask back in the maybe 70s, 60s about development are now kind of spread around a whole lot of different departments, including geography, including economic anthropology, including political science. So this is just a thought, and I'm very curious to hear your idea on this. I mean, isn't the problem that we still identify the field of economics as sort of having a monopoly over issues of economic development, whereas in fact it's only one of the many disciplines that has something useful to say, using a very specific set of tools and methods alongside a whole bunch of other fields that perhaps policymakers should take more seriously. And so in that sense, it's not so much that economists are doing something wrong. They're just really good at promoting themselves. And maybe it's also a bit of a historical legacy as sort of the sole people who really understand economic development. And then maybe, can I ask another small question? I mean, you briefly touched on, and apologies for missing the first part of your presentation. You touched a bit on the comparison with between Africa and Southeast Asia, where Southeast Asia has begun to grow very fast, of course, in recent decades. I'm a historian, so for me that's recent. So I wonder, proof is in the pudding, right? So what useful knowledge have economists produced to understand and maybe even aid that process of development in Asia? I think isn't that a crucial question if we want to sort of evaluate what economists have brought to the table, and if it's good or not? Yes, we can look at Africa, but we can also look at Southeast Asia. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that one too. Thank you.
So who would like to respond first?
Professor wants me to go first. Let me go first. Okay. But I'll answer the first one. The second one, I can't answer that one. The first one, thank you so much. I agree with you. I agree with you that economics is just one of those disciplines that provide answers to economic development, just like history, just like geography, just like sociology and psychology. And that's why originally economics was a social science. And even here in the university, initially, actually for me, when I was doing my undergraduate, I did it from social science. Economics was still a department under social science. And in my first year, I studied the sociology and social administration, because that was the structure of the program then. You had to do 3 subjects in your first year. But I was more inclined to economics, so I dropped and then became a 3-1-1. And so economics is just a social science, part of the other social sciences that offers solution based on its on the theory that it has, or its foundations. And that's why I said that we look at a person as an economic agent. For us, we look at a person as an economic agent, as sociology looks at a person as a social being with certain aspects. For us, we look at a person as an economic agent, and we interpret their behavior based on economic parameters. And that's how we think. And I think we have something useful to offer with our own thinking. Just like even the politician will view things differently. For them, they'll look at power. They look at an individual, how do they wield power, what causes them to wield that power. And all the disciplines are very useful. And I think they need to be complementary.
Thanks for your interesting questions. And I want to respond to some of you just said, if I could. Basically, how many geographers and economic anthropologists affect economic policy in the world? Not very many. And so it's overwhelmingly dominated by economists and all the baggage they bring. And that's one of the problems, one of the issues we have with the enormous problems we have in the world today. You know, I was just lecturing, and I'll lecture again, and I was just lecturing in Ireland at the Department of Foreign Affairs, you know, and Irish Aid, talking about the huge inequalities in Africa, what it's created, and also why some of it has come from completely misguided policy arising from neoclassical economics, you know, because of the enormously problematic nature of where they think income comes from and the whole nature of reward. So the real problem is that, and Dr. Boom has basically raised the issue that, well, we can look at, we have the economic agent and we have the social being. How do you separate the two? A human being is very complex. And when you begin to derive policy from isolating the economic as you see it, and I would argue the economics much more complicated than the typical notion in neoclassical economics of economic behavior, and the social being, you really mess the world up. And let me give you an example. So one of the things I've been doing is we've been working for 16 years now in Tanzania, looking at the impact of hatimiliki, property right formalization. And the neoclassical notion says, what do we do? Well, there's Dempsits and a whole variety of other people that argue property rights must be recognized by the state. And in the process, what will happen is it'll provide the incentives to invest and to work harder. You can pass it on. You can get access to credit through collateral, etc. The problem is an individual farmer getting an individual property right disconnects him, or occasionally her, because that's not what ends happening, from their social setting. And so what ends up happening? Well, you end up disenfranchising the women because the men really don't want them on the title. And which wife do they use? And so you're forgetting what role the individual is in their control of the farm and the underlying very problematic theory. This is going to lead to results. But then you have all the spillover effect. And what ends up transpiring is you end up then disenfranchising the property rights that were there recognized informally by trying to formalize it with this neoclassical model of what's going to work. Again, how do we know this? Well, we have empirical data on this. We go out and we actually, we don't believe the neoclassical notions. And so we go out and we say, okay, what is the data telling us on this? Well, I have no problem rejecting neoclassical hypotheses, right? Because I'm not a neoclassical economist, but I have to have the data to do that. One last point I want to make, a couple other very quick points. So RCTs, and I'll send you a paper I've written on it. RCTs are absolutely embedded in neoclassical economics, and in a lot of cases, it's really all about, there's so many methodological problems. I mean, the biggest problem, of course, is external validity and your capacity to generalize any policy from it. And it's incredibly expensive. But the other problem with it is that a lot of it has to do with the notions of incentives and how do we move people in one direction or the other. And it's a neoclassical notion of incentives. And I could tell you about how incredibly unethical it ends up being and the consequences of it. And so now the big catch meow is, well, there is no development economics. We just got to go and do these experiments to discover what's going on the ground. And it's incredibly problematic. Remember, I'm an epidemiology professor too. And the RCTs were originally formulated for drug studies. It doesn't work very well in the real world on behavior because it's incredibly complicated. You're not dealing with a biological item in which you then deal with the problem with false negatives or positives that arise because of the placebo effect from something. But at least you can isolate that by having double blinding. The problem is you can't do that in the real world with any of it. And there's so many methodological problems. Again, I'll send you the paper with it. And that's now become the cat's meow. But I assure you, a lot of it is based on still thinking of the notion of homo economicus, and then finding ways to, in this world of rationality, of just kind of nudging people in a direction which they will work in a manner which is consistent with the outcome we're trying to get. And so it's completely disconnected. And finally, the question of Asia and Africa. I did a book on that in 1995 called Asian Industrialization in Africa. I went out and I traveled all over Africa, but I didn't think I had the expertise. I got experts analyzing and comparing the trajectory of Asian industrialization to Africa. And you say, okay, Stein's an institutional economist. It was very interested, was very critical of neoclassical economics. But then you had a series of other books coming out. It was the cat's meow then. One of them was the East Asian Miracle Study by the World Bank. What did that argue? Kind of just keep following neoliberal policies because that's what they did in Asia. It was complete nonsense, but it was their way of interpreting. And what happened was it came out of an argument, and I was living in Japan at the time. It came out of it shortly after that. And it came out of an argument that between the World Bank and the Minister of Finance saying, we think, credit being allocated by the government can have a positive effect. And they said, okay, and we think that's important in terms of the Japanese transformation. So the World Bank said, okay, give us millions of dollars and we'll go study it. They couldn't have been happy with the results. And there was another book written by this guy Lindor and another guy that actually interpreted the Asian miracle entirely in neoclassical terms. And we were supposed to have a big debate. It didn't work out. But in some senses, mining East Asia and understanding what transforms also depends on what tools you bring in to actually interpret what's been transpiring. And unfortunately, it didn't have a big impact, this empirical investigation on the neoclassical commitment to structural adjustment.
So maybe just add one more question about. Yeah, I've got a list here. I'm deciding, but I think I'll go to like the big one, which maybe as a non-economist, but isn't just in general. Like if you step out of the battles within a department and just say there's a dominant form of economic power in the world. It needs to reproduce its knowledge in order to maintain its power. Of course, this is what it's going to do, and that can happen through. That happens in every discipline, even when it's being critiqued, it still reproduces itself. But the other question then, if that's the case, if this is just about, not about academic, knowledge, it's just about how does Western economic power reproduce itself, isn't that going to change in the next few decades? I mean, there's in the news, China and Brazil are talking about pegging their currencies together to avoid the dollar. If the US dollar is if there's a multipolar world where the US dollar is not, in charge, the dominant currency, there'll have to be, economics will have to deal with that reality somehow. Is this more about how universities react to power that's beyond their control and serve to reproduce the way economic power works in general? I mean, if you want to solve a problem, if let's say you're an economist and you're interested in solving a problem of unemployment, to practically make that problem manageable for the Ugandan government or any other government, it has to speak in the language of the economic power that government has to deal with. I mean, so if you can say, here's a radical solution for, grassroots empowerment, but if that's not if a government can't do that for political reasons, both within internally and externally, what, will they respond? Like, in other words, if an economics department completely transforms itself and in a new model, won't they just then go back to being like history and departments and be ignored? The reason why economics departments are being invested in to reproduce this kind of knowledge, and people are paying attention to economists, is that they're speaking the right language to those in power. Looking at it from the point of view of a humanities discipline, we're ignored. Like, nobody listens to what we have to say. Thank you very much. But I mean, is this, is it sort of a catch-22 that, if what you're advocating is an undoing of economics, won't economics go in practice, like within, especially within African universities? I mean, isn't that trajectory sort of pointing in a less rosy direction, like what's happened in the performing arts and in the humanities? They used to be very vital, you know, in the 1960s, Ali Mazrui was, you know, debating Milton Obote, you know, in the press, and government ministers were engaging with political science, even with historians, with religious studies, often in problematic ways, but that's, today the humanities are, you know, unless one of our colleagues goes on, is a commentator on TV, we're not really part of the national discussion or the regional or global discussion about policy. So is this just a matter of that the discipline is what it is because it's, you know, it won't be listened to, or no one will pay attention to it if they go in our direction, like what's happened to historians and so on.
Okay, thanks, Edgar.
Like I'm just like saying, like what's happened to the humanities has been disastrous, partly because humanities disciplines have been fearful of being too, you know, of contradicting a consensus, and also because in the process have become irrelevant to the kind of knowledge that governments think that they need, and these multilateral institutions think that they need. And yeah, we're
Okay, so I presented a couple of years ago a paper at the economic meetings with Isabella Weber, who wrote a terrific book on basically on China, you know, and Isabel and I were comparing the transformation of the economics profession in China versus the global phenomenon, you know, and what she basically found was that the economics profession in China has also completely dominated by neoclassicals, but they were never given any power to affect policy. And so they had their own people, engineers and otherwise, inside the party that continued to do things. But then what China, one of the reasons why was China interested in having neoclassical economics? Because it's also instrumental in the sense that it allowed them to provide the cover for what they were really doing versus what they were making people think they were doing, like joining the World Trade Organization. And, you know, and so it was extremely important because then they would have these representatives, you know, like you know, Justin Lin. I've been with Justin a few times, the former chief economist of the World Bank, the first Chinese to become the chief economist of the World Bank. He's a hardcore neoclassical, trained at the University of Chicago, you know, the most neoclassical of the neoclassicals, you know, and he lives in a neoclassical world. So his idea of industrial policy is it's got to work within your comparative advantage. Well, that's okay to kind of certain sects of the neoclassical economics, and that allows the cover to say, hey, we're no different, China, than you are, you know. So it's still very instrumental, and so what ends up happening is also the question of it doesn't fall back to a kind of simple notion of instrumentality. It's also how that instrumentality can be used in an effective way. How does power then manipulate something that exists that reproduces itself with a lot of empowerment internally, you know? And so you know, one of the big differences between China and say United States, well, the United States mostly listens to the neoclassicals and China doesn't, you know. And then I would argue with it, well, we'll look at the huge economic pathologies now in the United States that we're seeing as a result of the huge distribution. So what I'd argue is that it's a question of what motivates you, you know, and my motivation as an economist is always, I want to improve the way people live. You know, I've always had this strong dictum that if economics is not serving people and finding ways to raise their standard of living, then you are not doing what you should be doing. And that means always being a real world economist and understanding that your theory and your analysis has to be embedded in the real world. But that isn't necessarily very good if I'm getting up and saying, look at the huge economic pathologies associated with the inequality that's being reproduced with this kind of economic policy that comes from this kind of economic theory. Anyway, so it's complicated, you know, and there's no simple one-to-one relationship in between the discipline and the outside power.
You know, we're well past 4 o'clock, but I think I just want to thank you, you know, for what I like about, as a historian, what I like about when I listen to economists is very clear and direct debate. As historians, we're often esoteric and and evasive, and so this was really, I think, for me, a really fascinating discussion, and I hope for everyone online here as well. So thank you again to Professor Stein and Dr. Puma for this really fascinating discussion. Yeah. And just to let everyone know that we have another seminar on Wednesday with Dr. Jacqueline Namkasa, who will be speaking, I believe, about gender and the 1979-1980 transition in Uganda. So please stay tuned for that as well.